comments and observations on our material that we gave attention to here, and continuing the things that we have learned. We want to switch directions here just for a moment now as to the matter and material that we're going to give consideration to. And to introduce this material, I wanted to introduce it by quoting some information from the Society as they introduced it. And this is how they began. They said, in the beginning, I felt low, and this mood lingered. I didn't feel like going anywhere or doing anything, nor could I concentrate. I became despondent, confused, and began to think that my entire life and my good record of service to God was not worth anything. I grew panicky, frightened. Thus, a 48-year-old witness who had spent many, many years as a missionary described her feelings. I had always been healthy, physically and spiritually, but then I suddenly felt that I would never, never feel good again. A mature brother also reports, I became very depressed because of my job. I would come home from work so despondent that I could not eat. I would leave the table and go into a private room and cry and cry. In fact, I just could not stop the tears. I was easily angered by others, and I kept thinking, where am I headed? Why is it happening to me? And it continued that way for 6 months. These persons suffered from major depression. Other reports tell that there are still depressed souls among God's people. Statistics for the world indicate a striking increase in depressed persons. Now, though persons with a relationship with God are often less affected by the situations inducing depression, they are by no means immune to this disorder. But now the Society raised this question, though. They said, but should, now notice it says faithful servants. It doesn't say unfaithful. It says, but should such faithful servants be so placed? In other words, if a person really is faithful, would they be affected by depression? In other words, if they are, it must be that they're unfaithful in some way or another. That was the directive of the question. But there's a couple of things as we begin our discussion this evening that we wanted to establish. First, did you notice that the Society used both a brother and a sister as suffering from depression? Both cases. Sometimes the brothers are very reluctant to come out and be honest about it, that they are suffering from it. It's kind of like crying as a man, that we don't dare because it's not masculine. And so the same with depression, to admit that they're having these difficulties, and they cover it up until circumstances become very severe for them. And so setting that aspect of the matter straight, both men, both brothers and sisters having difficulties with depression. Also, the purpose of these articles the Society has been writing has been helping us to be of assistance to those who are depressed. And you know, so many times as Jehovah's people, we do totally the wrong thing in helping a depressed person. First, if an individual comes to us and is acting depressed, we begin to feel that, well, how can you possibly be depressed? We got the new system, we got this and this and this, all these things to look forward to. In fact, probably the reason you aren't depressed, or you are depressed, is because you're not coming to the meetings, you're not studying, you're not commenting, you're not praying. And then we go a step further, we say, if you went out in the ministry more and you had a Bible study and you had this and you did that, then you wouldn't be depressed. The publisher keeps coming back and saying, but I still am. I'm doing all of these things. And so then we take it another step, don't we? We've kind of hung back from bringing up this point, but we say, well, if you're doing all these things, then the only other alternative is that you have done something wrong, and you're covering it up. So now, if you just be honest with yourself, think back, and if you would just spit that out and get that taken care of, then that has to be the reason for your being depressed. And of course then, we've made an accusation, they're feeling guilty, and so the negative aspect of that. And another aspect, just as we begin our discussion too, is the fact that those who suffer from depression, and if it's been a chronic case of depression, one of the things that begins to happen to them is that they begin to hear voices. Now, for us as Jehovah's Witnesses, one little light goes off up here. Big light goes off up here, doesn't it? And so now what's the accusation? They're demonized, right? Isn't that the thing we begin to say and tell, and we go to their house and we start throwing out everything that they have ever owned that might have any connection with demonism, and out it goes. First this and that and the other thing. Do you notice in the New Live Forever book, the chapter that deals with wicked spirit forces, that it makes the comment and observation that for individuals suffering from chronic depression, manic depression, that this is a common byproduct of this difficulty is the hearing of voices, and it says not necessarily related to demonism. So again, can we see the negative effect that we have had on those that maybe have made some of these comments to us, our overreaction to that difficulty or that circumstance, when in fact it's been just a byproduct of their chronic depression. What an accusation to make. So, as we begin our discussion, we use some scriptural examples. We want to keep this one fact very much in mind. That because a brother or sister is suffering from depression has no bearing whatsoever on their spirituality. Because a person is depressed does not mean in any way that they are not a spiritual person. Let's take the case of Job, just so we can look at some circumstances. We all know what happened to Job, don't we? And all the things that befell him. Going to Job chapter 29, but now in the case of Job, had he become less of a spiritual man? Had Job done something severely wrong, and that's why he was suffering from these difficulties? Not at all, had he? There was nothing wrong on Job's part. He was a victim of a circumstance, wasn't he? And yet, Job could tell something had changed. He said here in verse 2 of chapter 29, he says, "Oh, that I were as in the lunar months of long ago, as in the days when God was guarding me." He could tell something had changed. Verse 4, "Just as I happened to be in the days of my prime, when intimacy with God was at my tent," again indicating a change of circumstances. As he said, "when my attendants were all around me." But now when we look at the example of Job and what brought on this testing circumstance, it wasn't because of any doing on Job's part, was it? But now you read the account, he mentions here about his attendants had previously been around him and so forth. But when we read the account and we see what the three supposedly faithful friends of his had to say, did they look objectively at the situation, or did they do many times like we do, like the little scenario of circumstances that I mentioned earlier? See, they told Job, didn't they, that obviously any intelligent person at all can take a look at what's happened to you, Job, and you've done something terrible. See, that was the conclusion they came to, wasn't it? In fact, like we do the friends. Well, if you've done certain things and you still feel this way, then obviously you've done something wrong and you're covering it up. We know the effect of that on Job, don't we, and the advice from his three friends. In fact, his wife even took it a step further, didn't she? She said, "It's so obvious to me, Job, what you've done. And it's so bad, you may as well curse God, kind of finish it off, and then die, be done with it." See, that was the extent of her concern and interest. And so as these factors began to build, going back to chapter 10 in verse 1, notice how desperate really Job got to feeling. And yet remember, Job had not changed as a spiritual person. Earlier in chapter 1 it said that he was the most prominent of all the Orientals. And he had done nothing to change that personally. Notice what he said in verse 1 of chapter 10. He says, "My soul certainly feels a loathing toward my life." In other words, the vernacular of the day, Job said, "I'd rather be dead." Didn't he? That's what he said. In another place in the scriptures, he asked Jehovah, he says, "Jehovah, let me die, put me in the ground, and just leave me there. Take me out of this circumstance till the resurrection comes along. That's where I want to be." That's how depressed. He was at the point of being a manically depressed person, wasn't he? Now, in the congregation, if someone's really down, having difficulty, and they say, "I'd rather be dead," how do we react to that? An explosion of exclamations on our part with the new system and living forever, "Do you want to be dead?" Again, does that help them? Does that give them assistance? See, remember in the case of Elihu, he patiently listened to all of these other points of advice. But then he began to present matters from Jehovah's viewpoint, didn't he, and reason with Job to get an honest look at what had taken place. Jehovah, we know, did some reasoning with Job as well. And so we know that in Job's case, he eventually comes out of it, doesn't he? Here in Job chapter 42, which is the last chapter in verses 16 and 17, that in the case of Job, now, again, his circumstances really get turned around, and so he's able to come out of the situation. In verse 16 it says, "And Job continued living after this 140 years. Now that was kind of a nasty trick on Jehovah's part. If Job kept waiting, I want to die, I want to die, I want to die, and Jehovah made him live another 140 years, it was kind of a dirty deal, wasn't it? But Job didn't keep feeling that way, did he? As it says, he came to see his sons and his grandsons 4 generations. It says, then gradually Job died. How? It says, old and satisfied with days. He was tickled to death, wasn't he, to have gotten to live another 140 years. So here is one example of a faithful person who stayed the same level of spirituality, basically. He suffered from depression, down, and he did come back out of it again. But now, another cautionary thing, that just because some of these examples in the Bible, that they suffered from depression, they went into it and were able to come out of it, not every one of Jehovah's servants is able to deal successfully with depression. And we want to use a little example to show why that's true. You see, today, even in the congregation, a physical handicap is very obvious to us, isn't it? And a person that is in a wheelchair or crutches or sightless or whatever the case might be, that is very obvious, and we don't expect that to change, do we? But now in the case of a person who is mentally handicapped, because it's a little more ambiguous, not so clearly defined, we have a tendency to think that forever they're going to just come out of that situation, just going to snap out of it. We want to keep in mind that for the person who is mentally handicapped, they are in a much more severe circumstance than the physically handicapped. And because of that, they need much more attention on our part, even than the physically handicapped person. You see, because for the physically handicapped person, if they have to have a wheelchair, it's obvious to them what the problem is, isn't it? And so they know they aren't going to do anything to alter that situation or change it in any way, and they can understand. But now for the mentally handicapped, in every way they look normal just like everyone else. But you see, they can't understand why they're of the frame of mind that they are. And they, in the worst way, don't want to be handicapped any more than the person who is physically handicapped. And yet because they cannot understand it, then they need, because of that, much more attention, much more assistance by us than even the physically handicapped person. Yet the society and the environment we have grown up in today, it takes just the opposite attitude, don't they? For the mentally handicapped person, what's their recommendation? Come on, snap out of it. Get going. Get this thing going. Just a matter of mind over matter. So many times it's treated in that fashion. Now, as with physical disabilities, there are certain things that cause it, so likewise the mental difficulties or handicap. Some individuals who suffer from depression, this mental handicap, can come about because of a chemical imbalance. My oldest sister suffered for many years because of having a series of nervous breakdowns, severe depression, chronic, even to a manic stage. And finally, with her, after a great deal of research, they found in her case that it was a chemical imbalance. And by the use, in her particular case, of lithium, and under doctor's care, psychiatric care, professional care, she was able to deal with that. And as long as she stays on that medication, she has no difficulty. But if she goes off from it, she reverts right back to the same difficulties. But now sometimes as friends, there again, we are the worst enemy of the one mentally handicapped. Because of our thinking about this, just being something you can snap out of, or mind over matter, you know, we go around and we get to tell you, well, you don't need the professional help. For one thing, you don't need the psychiatric help, and another thing, you certainly don't need that medication. You know, because if you're really healthy physically as a person, you wouldn't need it. So if you'll take half a bottle of megavitamins and a half a bottle of herbs and 2 bottles of bee pollen, why, you'll be just as happy as you could be, and no difficulty at all. And yet, how about if we have someone here in the congregation who, let's say, is a brittle diabetic? And so we tell them just to have confidence in Jehovah, pray a lot, come to meetings and throw your insulin away. What's the case in 2, 3, 4 days? They're dead, aren't they? In effect, for the person who is mentally handicapped and has a dependency on these drugs, it's the same effect. We had a brother encourage my sister to quit taking the medication, the same routines. Use all these vitamins, all of this and so forth, and few back adjustments and this type of thing, and just calm down, throw your medicine away, get rid of your professional help, and you'd just be all right. About 3 weeks, she was right back in the hospital, just as bad as she'd ever been. And if you've ever worked with persons who suffer from depression, who are mentally handicapped, you know the one thing they want to get rid of in the worst way is the medication to begin with. It's just like the person in the wheelchair. So they hate that wheelchair after a while, don't they? Because it's a symbol of the fact that they aren't normal like everyone else. For the person that is mentally handicapped, the medication is the thing. They want, in the worst way, to be able to throw that away, because if they could throw it away, then that would convince them they're just like everyone else. And so when we go along and encourage them, it'd be like going out to eat with a person that's a diabetic and encouraging them to have 3-4 pieces of pie with ice cream on each one. It's exactly the same effect. So again, if we can understand, see the circumstance and the situation that they are dealing with. But now it's also true, isn't it, that all of these difficulties with a mental handicap or depression aren't related physically, are they? But also a lot of it has to do with our thoughts and our feelings and our letting other people down. In fact, in most circumstances, because of letting ourselves down. There's no self-worth. Well, again, the Bible gives an illustration in the book of Philippians of a very faithful servant who suffered from depression. The man's name was Epaphroditus, the brother that had been sent by the Philippian congregation to help Paul out. And instead of his helping out Paul, he gets sick and Paul has to take care of him. And so in verse 25, this is what Paul is writing back to the Philippians because of a situation that's developed here with Epaphroditus. Philippians 2, verse 25. Paul writing, he says, "However, I consider it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus." Now notice the description of Epaphroditus. "My brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier." Anything negative there? Not at all, is there? And yet, notice his condition as it goes on. It says, "But your envoy and private servant for my need, since he is longing to see all of you, and is what? And is depressed." See, he's spiritually a very strong man, obviously. And yet he's suffering from depression. He says, because you heard he had fallen sick. Yes, indeed, he fell sick, nearly to the point of death. But God had mercy on him. In fact, not only on him, but also on me, that I should not get grief upon grief. Therefore, with the greater haste I am sending him, that on seeing him you may rejoice again, and I may be the more free from grief. Therefore, give him the customary welcome in the Lord with all joy, and keep holding men of that sort dear. Again, nothing negative, is there? He's suffering from depression. He's mentally handicapped at this time. And what's Paul say? He says, and keep holding men of that sort dear. He says, because on account of the Lord's work, he came quite near to death, exposing his soul to danger that he might fully make up for your not being here to render private service to me. So yes, Epaphroditus was depressed. But now, when we really stop and think about why he was depressed, and evidently quite severely, to us feeling good tonight, we might think that's really silly. Because now remember, Epaphroditus was sent to look after Paul. Right, as again, Epaphroditus got to thinking that way, didn't he? See, that he was felt guilty, that he'd let the Philippian congregation down, because here he was the one sick, and Paul was having to wait on him. So, for having let them down, he was depressed. And also, as the account mentions, it says that he knew because he'd been so sick, they didn't know if he was going to live or die, evidently. The Philippians back there had heard about his being that sick, and so they were really worried. They were depressed because he was sick. And so then Epaphroditus, hearing that they were depressed because he was sick, he was depressed because they were depressed, right? Kind of a vicious circle they were going through. But now when you think about it, when we're feeling all right, we would think, now, Epaphroditus, you're a grown man. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Snap out of it. Let's get going with things. We got things much more important to do than that. But how does Paul treat it? He sits down and writes a book, doesn't he? The book of Philippians, a letter to the Philippian congregation, and sends Epaphroditus back with it. Again, in a positive way, not demeaning in any way what Epaphroditus was going through, and he told the congregation. Now, when he gets there, what did he tell him to do? He says, you hug this man up, but good. Because that's what he needs. He needs reassurance that he's worth something again. He feels like he's a total failure. Yet still he says, my brother my fellow soldier, fellow worker, one dear to him. So again, we do not equate depression with a lack of spirituality or the doing of something wrong. It does not necessarily have to be that way. And especially among Jehovah's people, we're very sensitive to the needs of others, aren't we? And when we're sensitive to the needs of others and feeling our responsibility of looking after others, that can have a bearing on our susceptibility to depression. So the Society laid out for us some very interesting points to keep in mind when dealing with our brothers and sisters on this matter of depression. The first point that they mentioned was always to be positive in dealing with our brothers and sisters and not critical of the person when they are suffering from depression. Never critical, always positive. They said one Christian woman who suffered a crippling depression stated, "Most of all, you need to know that others care about you as a person. You need to hear someone say, 'I understand, you will be all right soon, I appreciate your experience, and I like talking with you.'" See, the thing that's caused the depression in the first place is these individuals are convinced they're not worth anything. And so they need a reminder, not just once, but over and over and over again, that they are worth something. In fact, it might be called, again, we talked about the physically handicapped and the mentally handicapped. I think anyone knows if they've ever had an arm or any other limb severely broken. Maybe you've had it in a cast that includes the elbow, let's say for 6 months or 9 months or a year. Now when you take that cast off, do you take that arm and go like that with it? Fall right off again, wouldn't it? And so, very likely, in fact, maybe you can't move it yourself at all. And so they send you off to a therapist, a physical therapist. Now do they grab the arm and go like this with it all over the place? No, maybe they move it just a little bit, right? That drives you crazy. Just move it a little bit. Now they do it, you go in there on the first of the month, they go plunk, plunk. They send you home, bring you back next month. Plunk, plunk. Do that once a month. No, you go in there what? Several times a day, don't they? Maybe for a great thing. It's just a very simple thing, but over and over and over and over again. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, after your patience and the patience of the therapist, improvement is finally to where this arm can be used again. Do we realize that when a person is suffering from depression, that the mind is in a cast just like that? And so these little visits, this little encouragement, this reminding of them, has the same effect, and over and over and over again. Little things these ones need. Not being critical. The physical therapist, does he make fun of the person because they can't move their arm like everyone else? Not at all. But do we make fun of these ones maybe by telling them just to snap out of it and get going? Diminishing it as if this really is no consequence? So always be positive over and over and over again. Never being critical was one point the Society made. Another one that they mentioned is to continue to have empathy. Put yourself in the position of that other person and never say, "Oh, come on now, let's just snap out of it." And that we can underline with 5 red lines if you want to. Absolutely, categorically, under no circumstances, ever tell a depressed person to snap out of it and get going. His comments here said, "One lesson I'll never forget," admitted one Christian mother who suffered with depression. "I learned empathy. Before I used to think that all you had to do was to pump yourself up and get going. So I never had much fellow feeling for others who were sick." She says, "Now I know. But some of the friends told me to snap out of it. There wasn't anything that I wanted to do more. But at that point I had no control. Their comments really hurt. Depressed persons need fellow feeling extended to them from others, and we might add, over and over and over again." See this little thing? Over and over and over again. You notice I mentioned there of never telling him to snap out of it? See, again, this shows how we think of a mentally handicapped as opposed to a physically handicapped person. Would we ever walk up to a person in a wheelchair and say, "Come on, get up and walk"? That's nonsense riding around that thing. We'd be mortified, wouldn't we? But someone that is mentally handicapped, we may say that over and over to them. In fact, it has the same effect on them as it would on the person who is physically handicapped. The exact same effect. One circumstance in our circuit that we had, a sister came in and we met the congregation on Tuesday night, and she came over and she grabbed a hold of Sister Collar and I and said, I've just got to talk to her. You can tell by the look in her eyes. It was just desperation. So away we went, and we found she'd been a sister pioneering for 15, 20 years, very faithful sister, been suffering from depression, and she was convinced that Jehovah didn't love her, the congregation, her family, no, and she wasn't worth anything. So I wouldn't have done any good to bawl her out, would it? So we tried to reassure her of how the congregation felt and Jehovah felt, and we said a short prayer. We did it on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday night, and so forth all through the week, several times a day. But towards the end of the week, she would begin to perk up a little, beginning to get a little self-assurance, a little reassurance as to her own worth, and it's back to just this again, isn't it? So there's no attention to us, it's the method we're talking about. So the constant assistance over and over and over again. Person in a wheelchair, they need our help every day, several times a day, don't they? As we give them that kind of assistance, time and time again. 2, it mentions to be a close, supportive friend of the depressed one, and the value of that. It said the report of a study of over 500 persons concluded, more than heart, strong will, and a cheerful disposition, people may need close, supportive friends and families to ward off depression. Dr. Elkamer, a well-known psychiatrist, stated in agreement, it is vital that the depressed person have someone around who won't start lecturing, who will stay patient. This thing again, it's the simple little things over and over. Yes, a positive effort to help, such as by a telephone call, a short visit, a short note, may be deeply appreciated. One Christian woman was asked what form of treatment helped her the most, and she responded, the greatest one was being around my spiritual brothers and sisters. Otherwise, I would not have recovered. In our congregation of witnesses, there was love, concern, and understanding. And then she says, it was like a wall of protection for me. Now, to show what can happen if we don't act correctly as a congregation, one of the sisters that suffered as chronic depression, even manic depression, came into the congregation, and sometimes when we're depressed, we act rather offensive with people. And so this sister, suffering from depression, was acting that way. And so one of the other sisters went up to her and said, you just do all this for attention. Really what you need is just a swift kick in the rear. And that sister just swung right around like that, went right back out the door of the Kingdom Hall, almost committed suicide. Now it's true, isn't it, that sometimes people are in a wheelchair, they get a little offensive and get a little fed up. Not with us, is it? It's what they're dealing with. We keep on working with them, don't we, assisting them. We mentioned there about their doing things that maybe are a little bit offensive. This very sister that we had worked with all week long, even set aside some time for the ministry and so on, to spend time with her, keep reassuring her and so forth. And we've done it I don't know how many times through the week. It comes Saturday morning for service, and several of the friends were there, and we were standing there visiting, and she come through the door. She come through the door, and the first thing she did was to stop, set things down, and then tell Sister Collar and I off royally. I mean, she told us off from one end to the other, but good. Now keep in mind, you've already done all these things all week long. Now, what's our initial reaction to that? What word comes to mind when somebody treats you that way? Brother Meister? That's right. Tough, right? If that's the way you're going to be, well then, so be it. But you know that this reaction on the part of individuals who are depressed, that's a ploy on their part, that's a tool that they use to check you out, because you see, they're so convinced that they're not worth anything. See, that they have to keep proving to themselves over and over and over again that they aren't worth anything. So consequently, what they do is they do this, and then they say, well, then if you just back off, well, then you were just doing that for show. You wanted your conscience kind of clean on the matter, so you did what you could. Now I've acted this way. Now you've done your job. Now you can go out and you don't have to worry about me anymore. And so they use this frontal attack. See, and then if you come on through that, if they treat you that way and you keep right on helping and helping and helping, see, even in their mind, there's no way that they can come up with the fact that they aren't worth something. See, you prove to them unequivocally that they are worth something, because no matter how they act, you keep right on helping them. And the only reason you do that is because you love them, not because you're making a show, because nobody will put up with it. And so we prove to them unequivocally that they are worth something, and we do love them. And so be careful as friends that we don't let ourselves off the hook and say, well, I tried to help so-and-so, and look how they treated me, so I'm done. That's exactly what they wanted you to do. See, that proves to them again they really aren't worth anything. Now, when you listen to that, and you think of someone acting that way, and you think, yeah, that's pretty dumb. You know, that's about the dumbest thing. I mean, people are trying to help you, and you're acting that way. But let me ask some of you sisters, some of you wives, and you mothers, just to put yourself in a circumstance, let's say back February, March 1st, that, if you're cleaning out underneath your sink, you're just fixing everything up all tidy and perfect. You got the new shelf paper done and all your boxes all lined up and everything is just perfect. And you notice that on the bottom of the trap, underneath the sink there, it's rusting right through the bottom. It's not doesn't need tightening up, just rusting right straight through. That's just a drop every hour or two, so it's no big problem. You say, dear, I don't mean this hour or this minute or this day, but the thing's going to give way one of these times. Would you fix it? Oh yeah, I'll fix it right away. What happens? March 1st, April 1st, May 1st, June 1st, July 1st, August 1st, September, October, November. Hadn't touched it, right? So this Sunday you've agreed to have the speaker over and his family and so forth, and you got to put the meal on, get it cooking, have everything all set, so when you come home from the Kingdom Hall, bang, the meal's there. You just served the family up a nice breakfast, you're dressed fit to kill, ready to go out the door to the Kingdom Hall, and you got this nice great big basin full of dirty, filthy, slimy water. You just pull the thing out and run out the door, and what happens? Away goes the trap, right? So bloom, down it goes, kicks the door open, all that water comes flowing out here, and these nice new high heels you just love is filled up with greasy, slimy water that marvelous detergent didn't do anything to, fills it all up, running out here on the floor and all over and so forth. Now, sisters, you say, dear, suppose you fix this now. Isn't there a slight explosion in the kitchen? Putting it mildly. What happened there? You start throwing everything you can get your hands on. Isn't it true? Things just start going all around the kitchen. First of all, you hate your husband now, right? And his lousy kids. And he's never going to have the speaker in your house again. You never cook a meal. And what's more, you're never going to the Kingdom Hall again. Never. And then after you've said that, what do? You've mentioned every terrible thing your husband's ever done in the last 25 years. Just like this. Then after you've had your say, out the door you go. You're going down the street, probably never come back to that house again. Now, why do you do it? Because you've been trying since February the 1st to get the attention of that lousy guy. Isn't that true? And everybody else's activities is more important than fixing that lousy drain. So it puts it off, puts it off, puts it off, puts it off. Probably there's no more put off, is there? And so all we're trying to do is get some attention. That what you want and what you need is of more importance than looking after someone else. And so for the person who is depressed, that being offensive, whatever the word you want to use for it, is a tool that they use to see what really they need, whether it's important to you or whether it isn't. If we don't do it, that convinces them that it's not. So again, we need to continue to remind ourselves that the mentally handicapped person is worse off than the physically handicapped one. They need special consideration, understanding on our part. But you might say, well, it's tough. It's difficult doing that. Well, that's true. There's no question about that. But notice what the Society said as to the longevity of our assistance. It says, until the disorder runs its course or responds to medical treatment, continued patience and understanding are necessary on the part of others. That's you and I here today. At times, there are situations where no form of medical treatment seems to work. Now, it's important to realize, for those who are suffering from depression, that for some, nothing will cure it. That they will just have to continue to deal with that circumstance. So long-suffering, along with self-sacrificing love, is needed on our part to aid these ailing ones. How long? Until Jehovah heals all sicknesses. And this is important. All sicknesses, mental and physical. Jehovah's organization is helping us appreciate that mental handicap is a real, valid sickness. And so just as a person who needs the assistance of a medical doctor, we have them go. For a person who is in need of psychiatric care professionally, and the organization encourages, they need that help and the medication. You say, well, I know some psychiatrists that are quacks. Well, there's some MDs that are quacks too, aren't they? But we keep going to them just the same, don't we? We find one that's good. Do we do the same thing then for those that need this professional assistance? As it said, till Jehovah heals all sicknesses, mental and physical, in the upcoming new order. And again, thinking about the wheelchair situation, if you have someone in the congregation that is in a wheelchair, it takes a lot of extra effort on our part as a congregation to look after them, doesn't it? Maybe you have to pick them up, take them back and forth to the Kingdom Hall, maybe errands during the week, take them out in the ministry, maybe even adjust the Kingdom Hall so they can get in and out of the Kingdom Hall. Put forth special effort to make them feel welcome and a part of the congregation and include them and so forth. A lot of extra effort. Now, do we tell that individual, now look, we'll do that for the next 3 years. Now, buddy, at the end of 3 years, you better be out of that wheelchair. That's all we're going to fool with it. Wouldn't think of it, would we? But we do it with people that are mentally handicapped. We said, I've tried to help that brother or that sister for the last 2 years, and they aren't all that much better. It's not going to do it anymore. So again, seeing mentally handicapped, physically handicapped, they're one and the same, as to need and attention and assistance on our part. So that's why the Scriptures mention, 1 Thessalonians 5:14, tells us to speak consolingly to the depressed souls. And as 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8 mentioned, it says you should be like one big happy family, according to the Living Bible. So as a congregation, as book studies, that's the way we're going to have to be, isn't it? So that we can assist these ones, give them what they need. Because the interesting thing about depression is that it can affect any one of us here tonight. No matter how spiritually strong we are, we can be affected by it. And so the more we as a congregation know about it, the better we'll be able to help one another. So that's why the society's used the expression lately, haven't they, of learning to speak with an educated tongue. Because to benefit those that are suffering from depression, we must use the educated tongue. So again, we thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you as a congregation. As mentioned, we look forward to a very fine turnout and activity in the ministry tomorrow morning.